between 1,347 and 1,351. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population died. Entire villages, entire cities, entire bloodlines gone in weeks. You know this. You also know the cause. Rats, fleas, the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. The story is clean, well documented, and taught in every school on Earth. There is only one problem with it. The numbers don't work. The geography doesn't work. The timeline doesn't work. And the rats that supposedly carried the disease across an entire continent, appear almost nowhere in the contemporary records. Not because medieval people failed to notice them, because they may not have been there. In the last 20 years, a growing body of researchers, epidemiologists, historians, geneticists, and climate scientists, have quietly assembled a case that the Black Death was not primarily a rat-flea epidemic, that the disease spread too fast, killed too many, and moved in patterns completely inconsistent with how bubonic plague actually behaves, and that the reason we were taught the rat story, the reason it became the official history of the worst demographic catastrophe in human history, has less to do with science than with politics, specifically with who got blamed, and who needed to be protected from that blame, and who had the power to write the history. We are going to go through the evidence, all of it. The Black Death arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying, covered in black swellings oozing blood and pus, their bodies already decomposing while they still breathed. Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of port immediately. It was too late. Within weeks, the disease had spread across Sicily. By spring 1348, it had reached mainland Italy, France, and Spain. By 1349, it had crossed the Alps and was consuming Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached Scotland and the far corners of Russia, the entire European continent in 3 years. This is where the first problem appears. Bubonic plague, the disease caused by Yersinia pestis, spread by rat fleas, does not move like this. Bubonic plague is slow. It requires a dense population of infected rats to sustain itself. When the rats die, which they do rapidly, before they can spread far, the disease loses its vector and stops. Historical bubonic plague outbreaks typically spread at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers per day, in optimal conditions. The Black Death moved at rates of up to 4 kilometers per day across terrain that included mountains, rivers, and winter conditions that should have killed the rat populations carrying it. This has never been satisfactorily explained. The second problem is seasonality. Bubonic plague is a warm-weather disease. Rat fleas die in cold temperatures. The Black Death killed heavily through winter, in Norway, in Scotland, in Russia, during months when flea transmission should have been essentially impossible. Again, this has never been satisfactorily explained within the rat flea model. The third problem is the death rate itself. Bubonic plague has a mortality rate of roughly 30 to 60% in untreated cases. That is catastrophic. But the Black Death killed 30 to 60% of the entire population, not just of those infected, but of everyone, including those who never came near a sick person or a rat. The only diseases that achieve that kind of saturation mortality are those transmitted person to person, by breath, by touch, by proximity, not by rat fleas. The fourth problem, and this is the one that breaks the model entirely, is Iceland. Iceland in 1402 experienced a catastrophic plague outbreak that killed between half and 2/3 of its entire population. Iceland had no rats. It had no established rat population in 1402. They had not yet arrived on the island. A disease spread by rat fleas cannot devastate a country with no rats. This is not a footnote in the historical record. This is a documented fact that the standard model of Black Death transmission has no answer for. The alternative hypothesis, developed by researchers including Norwegian scientist Gunnar Karlsson and epidemiologists Boris Schmid and Nils Christian Stenseth, is that the primary transmission route of the Black Death was not rat fleas. It was human fleas and body lice, parasites that live on people, not rats. Combined with pneumonic transmission, the airborne spread of the disease from person to person through respiratory droplets. This model explains the winter mortality. It explains the Iceland catastrophe. It explains the speed and the saturation. And it matches the contemporary accounts of how the disease actually spread, which describes sick people infecting those who simply breathed the same air. So if researchers have known this for 20 years, if the evidence against the rat model has been accumulating for decades, why is every school on Earth still teaching children that rats caused the Black Death? The answer requires going back to 1894. In 1894, a French-Swiss bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium now called Yersinia pestis in Hong Kong during an outbreak of bubonic plague. He also identified rats as a reservoir for the disease. His discovery was a genuine scientific triumph, and it was immediately applied backwards in time to the Black Death of 1347. The assumption was made, not proven, assumed, that because Yersinia pestis was responsible for the 1894 outbreak, it must also be responsible for the medieval epidemic. And because rats carried it in 1894, rats must have carried it in 1347. This assumption hardened into fact within a generation. It was in the textbooks by 1910. It was in the school curricula by 1920. And by the time researchers in the 1980s and 1990s began looking at the medieval evidence with fresh eyes, the rat story was so deeply embedded that challenging it was, and remains, professionally difficult. But there is a second layer to this story, one that most historians acknowledge quietly, and almost none discuss publicly. The Black Death did not emerge from rats. According to the most credible modern research, it emerged from Central Asia, from the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, where archaeologists in the 1880s found plague cemeteries with inscriptions dating to 1338 and 1339, 9 years before the epidemic reached Europe. The disease traveled west along the Silk Road, carried by traders, by armies, by the movement of people and goods across the greatest trading network the medieval world had ever built. This is documented. The genetic evidence from those 1,338 gravesites, published in Nature in 2022, confirmed that the strain of Yersinia pestis found there was the direct ancestor of the strain that killed half of Europe. The Black Death came from Central Asia, via the Silk Road, carried by human movement, not by European rats. Here is where the politics begins. In 1348, as the plague swept through Europe with incomprehensible speed and violence, people needed an explanation. The disease was invisible, unstoppable, and struck seemingly at random. The Church explained it as divine punishment. Physicians explained it as corrupt air, miasma, rising from the earth. And a third explanation, one that spread as fast as the disease itself, was that the Jews had poisoned the wells. Within months of the plague's arrival in Europe, pogroms began. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Spain. In Strasbourg in February 1349, 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive on the assumption that they had caused the plague. In Mainz, 12,000. The massacres preceded the plague in some cities. Communities were wiped out before the disease even arrived, on the assumption that their death would prevent it. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the violence and pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else. Nobody listened. The massacres continued for 3 years. Now here is the question that the historical establishment has spent 150 years not asking directly. When Yersin identified rats as the vector in 1894, when the rat story was constructed and then cemented as the official history of the Black Death, what did that narrative do to the question of human responsibility? It removed it entirely. If rats caused the Black Death, then nobody caused it. There was no human origin, no human movement, no human network that could be traced and held accountable. The worst pandemic in European history became a natural disaster, an act of God, or at least an act of rodents, rather than a disease carried west by human trade along a route that powerful interests had every reason to protect. The Silk Road was the economic foundation of medieval European commerce. The trading companies, the merchants, the city-states of Venice and Genoa that grew fat on Eastern trade. None of them had any interest in an official history that placed the origin of the plague on their shipping lanes. The rat story served everyone who needed the human origin of the Black Death to remain unexamined. The historians who first challenged the rat model in the 1980s were largely ignored. Those who published in the 1990s were treated as fringe figures. It was not until genetic evidence from the 2022 Nature study, physical, incontrovertible DNA evidence from the actual grave sites, that the Central Asian origin became impossible to dismiss. Even now, in 2024, the school curriculum in most countries still teaches the rat-flea model as established fact. The Nature study is not in the textbooks. The Iceland evidence is a footnote. The transmission speed anomalies are not taught. Here is what this costs us, not historically but right now. In 2020, when COVID-19 emerged and spread with a speed and severity that the world struggled to understand, the instinct of governments and institutions was identical to the instinct of 1348. Find an origin, assign blame, protect the trade routes. The debates about the origin of COVID-19, where it came from, how it spread, who knew what and when, followed exactly the same pattern as the suppression of the Black Death's Central Asian origin. We did not learn from the Black Death because we were never told the truth about the Black Death. A disease that kills 60% of a continent does not need to be explained by rats. It needs to be explained by the systems, the trade networks, the movements of people, the political incentives to suppress inconvenient origins that allowed it to travel. Those systems still exist. They are larger now. They move faster, and the instinct to protect them by blaming something small and scurrying, something that cannot speak, cannot testify, cannot demand accountability, is exactly as powerful in 2026 as it was in 1348. The rats did not cause the Black Death. The rats could not cause the Black Death. The rats were convenient. They always are. The real story of the worst pandemic in human history is a story about trade, about power, about who controls the origin narrative. It was buried. It is still buried.